Good evening. I'm Jim Gierak, and welcome to Chicago's War on Drugs. This is our 6th of 13 episodes, and on this show, the question that we ask everyone in the audience, as well as often our guests, is which is worse, the war on drugs? We will take that subject up later this evening, but before we do, I want to note that after last Tuesday's program, the following day I attended an event in Chicago that was called Chicago at the Crossroads, Solving Gun Violence. And there were many experts from Chicago that were on those panels, and the interesting thing to me was that not one person on any panel suggested that we change drug policy to address Chicago's violence. On this show, we do that. Secondly, many of you probably have seen that over the weekend on Sunday in Brighton Park, we had 11 people that were killed in one day. 10 people, 11 were shot. 10 people were killed in one shooting episode that was basically in retaliation for a previous shooting in the same day. So we end up in some neighborhoods, this weekend it happened to be Brighton Park, where we end up with ping pong violence, where prohibition leads the gangs to fight over turf, and we have one gang shooting at another gang, somebody getting killed, and then we end up with retaliation back. And so that type of ping pong violence coming from prohibition is what led the city of Chicago to allocate money. I think, if I recall, I think it was $1 million to cease fire in an effort to try to prevent that type of retaliatory turf war violence between Chicago gangs. It was an effort to stop the violence yet keep prohibition in place. And as a consequence, the violence, as we all know, continues to rage on. On this show, in contrast, we want to talk about drug policy. We want a heart-to-heart discussion between Chicagoans, between you sitting at the dinner table or in front of the TV this evening, to look to your spouse, to your children, to think about your neighborhood, your church, and ask, is this war on drugs making things worse instead of better? We have no right or wrong answers on this program. The idea is at least to discuss where we are with our war on drugs and the consequence that it's having, and then go from there. Now, these 13 weeks of programs are brought to you because we have Azteca Baseball League, a nonprofit organization which is sponsoring these 13 shows. And you can reach Azteca Baseball League at the website shown, and you can call the number shown down at the bottom to contact them either about baseball or about drug policy. Or you can contact drugnews1@yahoo.com and get more directly to me. Now, this is a call-in show, I should point out, so that if you hear or see something that you disagree with, you're welcome to call 312-738-1060 and let us know. But moving now to my guest, tonight it's my pleasure to have Reverend Hal Sharp, who I've known for quite a period of time, who has an interesting background. He's a graduate of, I should get my crib sheet out so I don't get anything wrong. He's a graduate of Princeton Public Affairs. He was ordained as a minister in 2017. His interesting career has taken him from being a chief financial officer for the University of Chicago for 15 years, then doing work with public welfare for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and then becoming the executive director for Protestants for the Common Good, and now the executive director of clergy for a new drug policy. Now, let's start tonight because it's an interesting smattering of employment and interest career that you've had. How do you go from finance to ministry to drug policy?
Because I'd lived a life before I became the chief financial officer at the University of Chicago. There were things percolating in my mind and heart. I had a wonderful opportunity to be of service at the University of Chicago, but as I got to later midlife, I thought, if I don't take this step, it was a midlife crisis, but a very good one. If I don't take this step now, I'll probably never do it. I tried divinity school right after college. Did it for a year in New York at Union Theological Seminary and thought, I'm not quite sure what I do as a suburban pastor. I'm interested in public policy. It was the Kennedy years. I wanted to be involved in some fundamental changes. I now think I know what I do as a suburban pastor. The church can speak out no matter where it is, but at that time I wasn't quite sure. But I went to divinity school at the age of 52 with a long history that took me there.
Well, and then I can understand the ministry and the calling, but then how does that, that's almost as bad as a police officer being against the war on drugs. How in ministry, where we outlaw drugs because they're bad and we want to protect people, how do you end up with this organization you have, Clergy for a New Drug Policy? Well,
I'm going to answer the question that you're probably going to ask in a few minutes. I'll anticipate it because I sort of knew it was on the horizon. You ask, which is worse, the drugs or the war on drugs? And in one sense, that's a false question because drugs are a reality. The question isn't, are drugs there? Addiction is terrible and one has to fight it. But the question is, it is there, so how does one respond? And as a person of faith, I would say the war on drugs is the worst possible response you could have imagined. You can argue that from any number of directions. There's one that you don't hear very often, but certainly people of faith, I think, will respond to this. Back in the 5th century, St. Augustine developed the concept of a just war. And there are about 6 or 7 major principles of what constitutes a just war. When, as Christians, as he was viewing it, but people of all faiths can subscribe to this theory of a just war, is it in fact justified to fight a war? The war on drugs fails on every major part of that just war platform, if you will. One of them is the notion of a just cause. Well, what is the just cause for the war on drugs, which incarcerates people for so often low-level offenses? If someone's an addict, they need treatment. If they're a recreational user of drugs, they certainly shouldn't be incarcerated. So simply on the question of just cause, probability of success, the war on drugs has failed. You have a just war only if you have some reasonable probability of success. What has been the success of the war on drugs? It's cost us $1 trillion. It's ruined lives, and it hasn't in any way curtailed the use of drugs. So take that principle of a just war, and you find that the drug war is worse than the drugs.
This Brighton Park incident I was talking about with all these people shot here on Sunday, there was a 21-year-old Brighton Park youth who was quoted in the Sun-Times as saying, "This won't ever end." I suppose that's another way of saying that this war is an unwinnable, counterproductive war that's just destroying so many neighborhoods in Chicago, the lives of so many people. We probably have ministers, rabbis, people of every religious faith out there who are active in their churches. What can these people do to change things in their neighborhood, to make things better?
Well, first of all, you change public attitudes, and I think that is beginning to happen in some ways. You try to understand why the war on drugs is a wrong response. I think in churches, what you can especially do is bring forward a deeper understanding of what drug addiction is. Drug addiction is so often a response to trauma, to stress. So the idea that you're incarcerating people because they're using drugs rather than responding to the reasons they use drugs in the first place, it seems to me churches can bring forward that message much more clearly than they have. Jesus said, "I've come that you might have life and have it more abundantly." Well, what are the sources of satisfaction in our life? That's what we ought to be helping people to find and to receive, to the extent that the horrible economic oppression that so many people live under. We ought to be dealing with that. We ought to be changing the south and west side of Chicago so that you don't have half of black youth literally not being able to find work and having no education. It's the war on drugs is a symptom, so often not a cause of drug use, and we ought to be responding to what those symptoms are. People in churches are in a position to do that just as broader society is.
What I've seen with churches and people in religious faith, what they're doing is they're out there marching, and they might be marching against drugs. They're marching against gangs. They're marching to take back our neighborhood. No one at any of these marches is saying we need drug policy reform to stop the violence, to stop the over-incarceration, to stop the racial discrimination, to enable someone to be redeemed and to go get a job even though they were convicted on some low-level drug offense. How do we get these religious organizations on that vein, that line of thought?
I think the war on drugs is so deeply entrenched in public attitudes that it's very hard to come out against it in the face of politicians that are so afraid of being soft on crime. It's not at the margin of easy change right now, or even it's very hard to change attitudes, and I think we simply have to be making the points that we can. What increasingly is happening now is the notion that diversion is possible. Police ought to be helping to divert people to treatment rather than, again, steering them to jail. It's now even called deflection, and that's happening all around this country. I know that you've heard in response to the opioid crisis that the police chief in Mundelein, and I brought him to a church and had him speak to a church group, followed the lead of the first police chief to do this in Gloucester, Massachusetts, who said, because of the opioid deaths that we're experiencing, if young people come in, give up their paraphernalia, we as police officers will not arrest them, we will take them directly to treatment. Well, as I say, I brought the police chief from Mundelein who was doing that there, and there are now 300 police chiefs similarly who were doing the same thing nationally, brought them into a church setting. About 40 people in Oak Park heard what this police chief was doing. They will spread the word. You've got to change public attitudes. You can do that from a perspective of faith.
Now, one of the things that I know you've been active in is to put together a religious declaration for new drug policy, which is a way that you've been able to have and find an outlet. I see we're having several callers. That's so much fun to interview.
Sure.
It's hard for me to break away. Let's take a call.
That's the point.
Caller? Our caller has just disappeared. Maybe we'll get him back in a moment. But as we were saying here, this religious declaration for a new drug policy, this is something that you've been presenting to other churches and people in the religious field, correct?
That's correct. I mean, Clergy for a New Drug Policy reaches out to clergy nationally to end the war on drugs and to seek a health, not punishment response to drug use. The religious declaration states why that is our position. It identifies issue areas that we want to work on, which will change the culture of punishment and bring a health response. We have over 300 clergy around the country that have signed the religious declaration in all states. Our goal is to have at least 500 and to have some in every state. The more we get, the more we'll be able to do what you were asking about earlier, which is to change drug policy in this country. I'm
scrolling down here because supporters to this petition, you can see that people from states, not every state, but from Arkansas, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Florida. I mean, religious leaders and organizations. Illinois has just a slew of them.
We have at least 200 from Illinois. 200 individuals, probably 80 or 90 who are clergy.
You know, I think when our audience sees that we have people who have religious backgrounds and obviously are not interested in people using drugs, who come on shows and they say, we need to reevaluate drug policy and get away from this idea of zero tolerance and punishment and criminalization and three-time loser laws.
Yeah.
It's got to be for a reason other than you're for drugs.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one thing that we can say in churches is that there is good religion and bad religion. Bad religion says all drug use is a sin. It's often cast that way because we have to have upright and appropriate behavior in every respect in order to gain salvation in the next world. I think that's not the constructive way. That's not the theology that I believe. I think it's, and I think the clergy that signed the declaration, religious declaration, believe. Drug use is a reality, as I said, and the proper response is to say, how do we ban all drug use, but how do we deal with drug abuse, which is a serious problem. So people of faith ought to be saying, how do we deal with that abuse, rather than saying in a blanket way, all drug use is bad. That's where Jeff Sessions goes amiss. He says anybody who uses drugs is a bad person. That, among other things, that's hypocritical. We all use drugs in some way, whether it's alcohol, whether it's other substances, and we need to have the most effective way of dealing with abuse.
I see we have a caller. Go ahead, caller.
Yes, sir. I waited a long time, but it's worth it. You guys talk a lot of good stuff. Father, and the gentleman next to you, years back, they had a bunch of people killing themselves with fireworks. So what did they do, the city? They got a bunch of unmarked squad cars, and every year for about 4 or 5 years, they went into Indiana, and that saved many lives. That saved us from going around with throwing firecrackers and all the rest of that stuff. So why is it so easy to stop the fireworks, and it's not that easy to stop the guns coming in from Indiana? That's what Emmanuel says. That's what all the others say. That they're all coming from Indiana. Well, send some people in there like you send them in for the fireworks. That'll stop.
Okay.
I'm going to let my law enforcement friend speak to that.
Okay. It was a little bit difficult, thank you, caller, to hear your question. What do you understand his question as he put it?
I had trouble hearing it as well, but I thought what he was saying is we've been able to stop fireworks from crossing borders. Why can't we stop drugs?
Well, you know, from a law enforcement standpoint, I'm a former prosecutor in Cook County and prosecuted homicides and drug cases. And the irony of the war on drugs, we put it in place in order to protect people from drugs. So the intuitive thing is say we're going to outlaw it. But when we outlaw something, we end up making it more valuable because many people want the substances that are outlawed. So what we do is we take something that grows in the ditch and has no value, and is marijuana, and now people want it. Government prohibits it to protect us, and now you end up with marijuana, one of the most valuable commodities on the face of the earth. So now, instead of kids steering clear of drugs, marijuana and others, they want to go into the business in order to make the money. I remember on the south side of Chicago in the early 90s, a young lad by the name of Bland was a 13, 14-year-old. And he just wanted to sell drugs till he had enough to buy I forget the name of it was an SUV. I forget the name of the car. but that was his goal, was just he was going to sell drugs long enough to get, and the kids who did sell drugs in the neighborhood put a bullet hole in the kid's head, and they killed him. So prohibition tempts people to do the wrong thing, and so we end up with more drugs instead of less, because the harder you try to repress drugs, the greater the incentive to import the drugs. And then in order to compete with your rival drug dealer, you increase the purity. And so we end up with stronger drugs, more drugs, when our intention was to try to protect people from drugs.
Yeah, and I'd like to build on that in a slightly different direction. The fact is, prohibition doesn't work. I mean, we certainly see that in marijuana, sure, where we've had now we have decriminalization, which is progress, but it's still a form of prohibition. And kids get marijuana without much trouble. 80 or 90% of high school students say they can get it. So and when it comes to marijuana, the question should be not whether it's used, but how you deal with abuse. Of course, you don't want young people using marijuana because of issues of brain development until they're 21. But you certainly, the main question is how you protect the health and safety of our communities.
I see we have another call, and boy, does
Okay.
time go fast. Caller?
Yes, good evening. My question to you gentlemen is, how would you stop people from getting behind the wheel of a vehicle if they've smoked pot? Because it's been proven that it has a horrible effect on people's reaction time. And I think that's where you're going to run into your big problem. If there was some way that you could control a situation where people who wanted to smoke their pot or whatever never got behind the wheel of a vehicle and it could be monitored, you might make some inroads. But there are so many people out there who do not partake of drugs. There are so many people out there in bad neighborhoods who've managed to find jobs. It's like you're making a victim out of people who have to eventually take responsibility for their lives. And if you even open the door one tiny bit on that, you never make any progress. So again, my question to you, how could you stop them from doing this? And I think you guys mean well, but you're not going to get anywhere.
Thank you, caller.
Sure.
You do it the same way you've done it with driving under the influence of alcohol. Nobody's condoning, if one says legalize marijuana, nobody's condoning that you drive under the influence of marijuana. But in fact, you've found with alcohol that it's a matter of regulation and education, not prohibition. And just as we have been able to decrease incidents of driving under the influence of alcohol, one can set the same standards, enforce the same laws, when people are using marijuana. They shouldn't drive when they're using marijuana, but that's very different than saying you prohibit marijuana because of the possibility that they might. Prohibition does not work, regulation and education does, and that's certainly been the case in the instance of driving under the influence of alcohol.
You know, Mexico produces 21,000 tons of marijuana a year, according to the United States Department of Justice Criminal Intelligence. A drug cartel from Mexico comes in and plants 4,000 marijuana plants 2 miles from my home. And another location in Orland Park, another multi-thousand plant farm put in place. Prohibition causes what we're trying to prevent. In Chicago in 2012, 8 tons of marijuana they seized in boxcars. They think it's a big bust. Well, it is a big bust, but not compared to 21,000 metric tons a year. Because we're legalizing marijuana in some states now, the Mexican drug cartels are suffering, and money that used to go to the cartels and the street gangs for those sales are now going to government to be able to provide for treatment, education. You know, we're coming down to the end here. What thoughts would you like to leave with our viewers that you think is important that could stop the violence and improve drug policy?
Well, I think we've got to view drug policy as a health, not punishment issue. I'm surprised at how few people really know the experience in Portugal, for example, where they have decriminalized all drugs, not just marijuana. In fact, drug use has not increased. Deaths by overdose are certainly down. Drug use, as I said, drug use has not increased. Crime, marijuana arrests and drug arrests have decreased. So you are taking the illicit market out of drugs, and at the same time, you're having a sane policy which achieves the goals that you want to achieve.
Well, I think that's so important. You know, years ago we needed the appointment of an addiction dean. We didn't need a drug czar. And right now it's interesting, the Trump folks are deciding to defund the United States Office of Drugs and Crime. I maybe don't disagree with that because it doesn't work. It's, everything in drug policy is counterintuitive. The harder you repress it, the worse the problem. And then we got the gangs shooting and killing each other endlessly. Like this one kid, it'll never get better. What a horrible thing to have people in Chicago think. It can get better, but not until we end this war on drugs. And there are many policies between legalization and zero tolerance that we need to sort out and pick the best ones. Now, again, I want to thank you very much for joining us on Chicago's War on Drugs. Viewers, I hope you appreciate it. Join us next Tuesday for more. And I'm Jim Gierach. Good night.